Hello, Fishkama, and welcome back to Future Proof's weekly webinar. We're very grateful to be joined today by Faith Bateman, who is Education Lead for the West of Scotland Development Education Centre, or WOSDEC, a Glasgow-based provider of global citizenship education for educators across the West of Scotland. Over the past decade, Faith has played a leading role in developing the modern studies curriculum in Scottish schools, as well as the creation of the award-winning My Diverse Scotland programme, which helps teach racial literacy among young Scots. We're also very lucky to have Mark Frankel on the call. Mark is head of public affairs for Full Fact, one of our partners for this project. And he was a former BBC journalist who spent nearly 2 decades in political programming for TV and radio, as well as social media output within his role as social media editor. As always, if you're participating in the call, please feel free to write a question in the chat and we'll make sure to ask it to our guests. I'm joined today by Santi. You say hello, Santi.
Hello. This is new to me. So please
Well,
feel please feel free to guide me on this wonderful journey through the world of Zoom and Teams.
I'm sure you'll be very adept. You're Generation Z. You've got the skills. And Sandy, feel free to button anytime if you've got a question for either of our guests.
Of course, but we'll
Um,
see. I've got a mental age of thought of around 40, so it's
don't do yourself down. Um, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can sign up for our next webinar, which will be on Friday, May the 1st at 12:30 British Summer Time by finding us at futureproof2026.co.uk. So to kick us off, I was wondering if I could ask yourself, Faith, what do you think having an active role within Scottish education, what do you think the implications of this upcoming election might be for the Scottish education sector? I know there's a big debate about um, the future of standardized testing and exams in Scottish schools, and also a big debate about the banning of smartphones. I think Swinny Sarwar and Russell Finlay from the Conservatives have talked about passing a bill to ban smartphones in classrooms. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, so I think with the upcoming elections, there's going to be lots of stuff that teachers and young people are going to be looking at closely in terms of what's coming. Because as we know, elections are going to directly shape like education policy. And I think the big thing, with the election, teachers know that pupils are going to be returned. We're coming back to school with lots of questions, things about, what they see on social media, etc. So the things that I suppose, from my perspective and the teachers that we work with, the key things are thinking about how, like you mentioned, smartphones there, what's that going to look like going forward, and thinking about social media, thinking about the what's happened in Australia in terms of the ban on that. I know there's a lot of chat around talking a lot about media literacy as well, because we know it's a fact. Young people are on social media. Is that how are we going to be looking at that? Is there going to be some sort of national plan going forward? Is it going to become a national priority? Really helping young people kind of navigate the complex world that they see online. So I think that will be one of the key issues.
Do you see a lot of engagement within Scottish schools at the moment with the election, or is it more muted?
To say, so I work directly more with teachers, and I think, I was a modern studies teacher, so yeah, within the modern studies classroom, it's I always feel like,
You're preaching to the choir.
absolutely, like, I would always, when I was in the classroom, I would always want young people to be engaged with everything that was happening, so I would do as much as I possibly could to just to make sure young people were seeing what was happening with the election. So yeah, I think if you're a modern studies teacher, social subjects teacher, yeah, you'll be discussing all of these things within the class. And like we know, young people, there's been lots of reports recently from, young Scott, for example, put a report out saying that young people want to know about what's going on. They want to be democratically engaged. They want to build democratic habits. So taking as much as possible will be trying to do that within the classroom for sure.
Going back to what you're saying about media literacy within the classrooms, I understand that you're largely responsible for trying to get the five W's of journalism into the teaching framework within schools. I thought when I heard that, it's quite funny because when I was at school, I was told that STEM was really your future. If you wanted to succeed in life, you needed to focus on the sciences and maths and technical subjects. But do you think there's a real need for more more of a focus on English and the humanities and critical media studies um, for the future of young Scots.
Yeah, I think no matter where your influence lies within the curriculum, whether it's STEM, whether it's humanities, which everything's online now, right? So I think young people do need, and I always view that social media probably isn't going to be going anywhere. I don't know. So young people need the tools. They need the tools to be able to interact with it. Because, when we speak to teachers and young people, we always do a poll when we do teacher training about what teachers think. And it's often quite split. Some teachers think they'll absolutely get rid of it, but there are teachers who do see the benefit in it. So it's about giving young people, like I'll probably say tools quite a lot, and teachers as well, like the framework, or like you mentioned the five W's. I mean, I've been a modern studies teacher, that's been around for so long. But when we talk about global citizenship, we feel within my organisation that global citizenship, there's lots of skills around that. In schools focus a lot on multi skills, different skills. That's things like communication, critical thinking, empathy. If we can really support young people, which loads of schools do, support young people to have those skills, then that can be transferred online. So no matter what subject you're doing, you're going to be looking at stuff with lots of different topics. If you have these skills, it's going to help you in your future career or whatever's next for you.
Could you just explain a wee bit what global citizenship is for anyone unfamiliar with the term?
Yeah, so global citizenship, um, it helps young people understand their rights, understand justice, inequalities, and I suppose global interdependence. And we really want young people to become active. We want them to be empathetic, responsible citizens who can, really think critically, and take informed action in their communities. And this could be like, globally, it could be globally. And it's rooted in human rights, sustainability, and anti-racism as well. So it's all about building global citizenship comes under such a big umbrella. And it's about building the person and just the idea that you grow up with almost like having a stake in the game, a stake in your community. So you want to be fully involved with that, wherever your interest lies, if that
And
makes sense.
in recent years, have you seen fake news and disinformation sort of threaten that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole issue around mis and disinformation is that it's, there's so many challenges with it, and it's coming into the classroom. So again, when I was a teacher, modern studies is meant to be so current. You watch the news, you chat about something. You think with all this stuff online, things are happening faster than quite often that we can respond. And when I was at school, it was like it was one form of getting your information, but now there's so many different parts. So within the classroom, you've got maybe echo chambers. Young people are only seeing the content that is within their algorithm. And as we know, a lot of it is quite polarized. So these really sensitive, really tricky debates are coming into class about conflict and climate and migration, all of these things are coming in. So the pressure is on the teacher to navigate them, to correct, I suppose, or to support. But for me, it's all about giving young people the skills to really see themselves in what they're seeing, and you're signposting to organisations like Mark, who they're doing all the fact checking, and you're giving them the tools to do that. But teaching knowledge, professional confidence is something that I would be having to build up within the classroom to try and deal with all of that. So, in short, in answer to your question, yeah, it does really impact it. But at the same time, I do think global citizenship's ideally placed to deal with to respond to the challenges that we're seeing.
And would you
Just
say in your experience of sort of you obviously spoke about how you regularly converse with modern studies teachers and talk to them about the concerns that students are having. How have sort of concerns about social media and misinformation increased in salience over the years? Have you seen a growth in the conversations you're having about that?
Oh yeah, 100%. Because when I started teaching like 18 years ago, it wasn't an issue. And having it's definitely more and more because more people are more out there. There's more information to be had at age. So it's not just modern studies teachers I work with; it's primary colleagues too. And so we're seeing that the age of a young person on a phone is becoming, it's becoming younger. So that presents quite interesting challenges within the primary sector too, because you have young people seeing content that they should never see because they're too young to see it. So yeah, I think across the education landscape, it's definitely becoming more prominent and has done for the last few years. Yeah.
Yeah, and building on that, a common debate that's currently being had by several world leaders across the world is about the ban of social media for under 16s.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is enough to really counteract this narrative, or do you think more needs to be done?
Yeah, I will say, I'm going to in the sense of that because I don't know. I don't know. I would really think that we maybe need to watch and see what's happening with other countries and see whether or not it isn't having an impact and it is making a difference. And like I mentioned before, pictures are really splitting, because like I mentioned, some young people are seeing things they shouldn't see. But social media it has a place. You can use it to teach. You can use it to enhance things that you're discussing or in class, etc. Um, so I'm sorry to sit on the fence. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that from a personal perspective, it's all about skills. It's all about having those skills for things that are in existence already. And I think we really need to, if my personal view is again, is that we need to really start with the critical media literacy skill really early and build that all the way through in an age appropriate way, of course. So it's something that young people are just being exposed to all the time. Think about critical literacy, think about critical thinking, empathy, being able to distinguish between fact and fiction. These are really, really important skills and need to be taught early on.
No, of course. And actually, don't be sorry at all about sitting on the fence because you've actually given me another question, which is,
So,
um, you've obviously spoken about how sort of social media can be used in positive ways to enhance learning in the classroom. Can you give a couple of examples of how that has worked in practice or where you've seen that?
yeah, again, I think it's often good for talking points. It's quite good. Have you seen this or have you seen that? Or you mentioned as well, something that came to my attention recently, we do a lot of work around like climate anxiety. And young people, there's the climate emergency that's happening, and we talk a lot about, if you do this, this bad thing's going to happen. How about you do this and then this will happen? And for a lot of young people, they internalize a lot of that anxiety. There are a lot of people now on social media who are kind of going against the grain and putting out some really positive climate stuff, like seeing things in other parts of the world, what's happening here, and look at the positive impact that's having. And so from a teaching perspective, I'm not suggesting all young people go on their phones in class, but for me, from my own professional knowledge, I would be like, oh, that's a really interesting story. So here's a really positive thing that's happening in relation to that. So it's good for finding information as long as obviously it's fact checked and we can corroborate it the same way.
Of course. No, no, that is something that is very important to us. I'm sure Mark Frankel from Full Fat will go into that in a little bit more detail
Yeah,
as well. But actually, leading on from that, obviously I was doing some research on WOSDEC earlier, and I noticed your project about promoting the Augusto Boal style theatre of the oppressed concept in
yeah,
storytelling.
yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and why you feel telling these stories is important. Because some people would argue that the press and social media is now responsible for telling these stories, but in many respects, they aren't quite enough to tell the stories that we need.
Yeah, the global storyline approach, so I will say I'll caveat with it's my colleague that's the expert in that. You have done some training around it. And the idea is that you go into school and you allow the young people to create a story. Sometimes they create a story, but then there are certain stories that you can go and do. And it really allows young people to be in the story and see things and see the impact and see the consequences that happen. And it really switches on their empathy, their feelings, and also at the same time allowing them to think about it's almost like personalizing something. Um, Quite a lot of the time you see things on the news, and for young people, particularly primary age children, it's difficult for them to see how that affects them and how that impacts them, because that's what global citizenship is. It's about looking at global impact, all the impact that has globally. So the global citizenship and storylines approach really allows young people to be in the story and see how it can affect them. But at the same time, showing them how they can have agency. And that's a big thing because obviously a lot of young people think that sometimes politics is something that happens to them. But the global citizenship education would argue if you can instill these really important democratic habits from a young age, then that builds into quite active participation. And that's what global storylines does really well, I think.
Yeah, of course. And I think it is important that we do have these conversations, especially about building empathy in a world where sort of the media landscape is quite oversaturated and we can pick our own truth. And
Yeah.
building on that, where would you say sort of social media and the press really fall down when it comes to that storytelling dynamic?
Suppose it's the when you go on to your Instagram feed, your TikTok feed, or whatever, because we're doing some work around media literacy right now, and young people are only getting one story sometimes. You know, if you're in that algorithm, I imagine you're only getting one story. And what I often think is it's really boring. Like the world is full of different stories, different narratives, different perspectives. And if we can get that message across to young people and say, you know, everyone has a different story, everyone has a different perspective, and try and put yourself in that and see from all these different viewpoints and perspectives. That's so I think that's the issue. It's just the echo chamber, the algorithm. Um, you know, you want to say, how you can we need to you can actively go and change that algorithm. You can actively go and seek to find out other perspectives. However, how often do we all mindlessly scroll? How active actually are we when we're on social media, when we're doom scrolling? We're just consuming. So it's about trying to train your brain to say, no, do it. Is this true? Is there another perspective? And you go and seek that out.
No, of course. Now, moving over to Mark now, because I know he's a little bit quiet. So, you've obviously sort of looked into sort of the Scottish election campaign trail and some of the deep fakes surrounding that. What are the most common trends that you've come across on the Scottish campaign trail? What are the issues which AI-related deep fakes and misinformation are really picking up on?
So I think the first thing to say, Santi, is that it's not that we're seeing a huge volume of AI generated content. We're seeing certain particular videos, particular images cropping up here and there. So for example, we saw a video from an independent candidate in Glasgow who decided to release a bunch of videos on Facebook and elsewhere, which are entirely AI generated. And we've been in touch with him, and he's now labelled those videos. That's just one example, and that's a story that we're writing up today. And we've also seen a few other very sort of small, relatively straightforward examples of people sort of touching up images or enhancing campaign literature of one kind or another, maybe sort of adding some, some visual tips and tricks to things that they've already produced, but nothing that is of a level that it is so deliberatively distorting that it would fall into a category of being potentially kind of egregious to the point of kind of anti-political activity or a sort of major disinformation campaign of one kind or another. I think we're seeing more examples of things that are the sort of classic statistical literacy issue, if I can put it in those terms, where parties have been talking about asylum seekers and how many of them there are in Scotland and how they're handled economically and so forth, which are somewhat dubious. Or they're talking about energy and making claims about their respective challenges, which are to some extent dubious. or they're talking about NHS waiting lists and waiting times and confusing lists and times and numbers. So there's a sort of literacy over data, and there's a literacy over particular policy areas that is the kind of thing that we often see in elections, where a politician will go a step perhaps too far in trying to misrepresent or trying to represent with massage, if I can put it that way, what their opponent is up to, or what the other political parties are presenting.
Of course. No. So what? So is it just sort of slips of the tongue that we're seeing here, or is it deliberate political messaging that is designed to massage the figure?
I'm not sure it slips of the tongue. I mean, I think a lot of this is a kind of misunderstanding of the statistics as they stand. So, to give you one example, there was a story that we did and is currently on our site about 800,000 people waiting for hospital appointments in Scotland. And if you crunch down the figure, or you look into the figure in more detail, what you actually discover is there's a lot of double counting. A lot of people are waiting for more than one appointment, and lists of patients waiting for appointments can be quite complex. It's not just a question of trying to take different waiting times in different parts of the country and trying to put them all together and say, okay, now here we have a total which is what it is. You've got to look at whether you're looking at one person or several people, whether it's one person waiting for several appointments, how long those appointments have been in the system, and so forth. There's a lot of variables here. So a lot of this is about literacy, actually, and the way in which politicians sometimes will look for a very large number because it's a sexy number and they want to talk about it, but without necessarily presenting the full context to that number.
No, of course. And obviously, Full Fact's mission is to help you crunch the numbers and some of those things, and you can find that on their websites and their socials. And building on that, obviously, Full Fact is a service which aims to help people, individual people that might not necessarily be familiar with sensationalisms and sort of the workings of political campaigning. So, what are the best ways you feel? Say, if someone was presented with a deep fake, what are the best ways of telling that is a deep fake? What is it that AI generated content is getting wrong?
So, look, I think the first thing to say is you don't need to be a professional, fact checker or have great expertise in verification to spot inconsistencies in AI videos. And a lot of them there are clear telltale signs. You'll see things in the background or in the foreground of a video that just seem odd. They could be objects that are passing you by that you think that would not be right in that environment, buildings that would be more familiar in another part of the country, logos that are giveaways for that video not being what it should be. A certain sheen on people's faces, that's another telltale sign, something that's almost too slick to be accurate. So there are things that you can look out for. But the other thing to say is that the tools that people are now using to create AI videos, synthetic videos of one kind or another, are getting ever more sophisticated. So it's becoming harder and harder to spot the kind of classic mistakes that we used to see maybe even 6 months ago. So, in its infancy, a lot of these video tools would present you with videos where if you look closer, you'd see somebody had 2 extra digits on their hand, or they had their arm didn't sort of come from their shoulder, or if you looked at their body, there were sort of limbs that didn't seem to sort of be in the right place. A lot of those kind of much more obvious distortions have been ironed out by the software, by the tools becoming more and more sophisticated. So the other thing you've got to ask yourself is, what's in the news? What do I know about this story already? What is the reporting that I can see and I've heard and I've read that would corroborate what I'm seeing in this video? So somebody shows you a video that is of a politician that's out campaigning or talking about something, and there is literally nothing in the news about that prominent politician being in that part of Scotland. And in fact, maybe quite the opposite, that they've been campaigning in an entirely different part of Scotland. Well, that's a fairly obvious reason to start raising some questions about what you're seeing. You don't necessarily need to be an expert in AI. This is about actually using critical thinking skills and being able to say that what you're watching doesn't tally with everything else you know about that subject and everything else that you know that is currently going on the campaign trail. So a lot of this is about actually just taking a bit of a step back, taking a deep breath, thinking about the bigger picture. What are the papers reporting? What are the broadcasters reporting? What do I know is actually happening? If I've seen, John Swinney in Aberdeen, and this video is of him allegedly campaigning in, central Glasgow, that would seem a little bit odd if it's supposed to be the same day. So just raise some questions. Think about the video in terms of what you know and what you don't know.
No, of course. And building on this idea that sort of AI is becoming more advanced, it's also becoming more accessible to sort of consumers. And with the news often talks about AI being produced and deepfakes being produced by nation states and being produced by sort of certain groups or sort of criminal gangs. But is there an increase in homegrown content? Are there people making deepfakes from the comfort of their bedroom that are going viral? Where is the AI generated content coming from?
Yeah, I think the answer to your question is it's a mixture of a lot of things. So for some people, if they have the desire to do it because they've got a message that they want to get out there, and they've got access to tools, and the tools are largely free tools. You can do it without ever leaving your bedroom or your living room, for next to nothing, no money. You just need 10 seconds of somebody's voice, or you need a certain number of images that you can download for free or for nearly free online, and away you go. So if you're a political actor or you're running a campaign and you're thinking, how can I do this and do it simply, cheaply, then that may be your motivation. But equally, you might be somebody, in a more nefarious way, who has an agenda. You're trying to disrupt something. You're trying to get under the skin of a campaign and really distort the messaging. So, we, for example, saw, and this isn't in Scotland, we saw some pictures emerge last week of a Reform MP, Sarah Potchin, who has been out campaigning in the local elections in England. And there were images that she produced for her own social media and her own campaigning, which showed her surrounded by supporters, fairly innocuous images of her just standing amongst supporters. And we discovered there were some images that had been, those images were doctored, and the same image was reappearing online with the supporters appearing as Asian rather than as a white British supporters. Now, you might think this is a bit bizarre. Who would doctor an image of a Reform MP to make it look like she was standing with people from an Asian background? That would seem, you'd almost imagine it happening the other way around rather than that way around. And drilling into the story a bit more and looking at the comments that we saw on social media, we discovered there were quite a lot of Rupert Lowe supporters. I don't know how much you know about Rupert Lowe, but he was somebody who was very much involved with Reform, then fell out with them.
Restore Britain.
Yeah, created Restore Britain, which is his own sort of movement, which is even further to the right of where Reform is, and talks about sort of repatriation of people and so forth. So there you had an example of an MP involved in the campaign, producing images, and somebody willfully, trying to distort that message to make it appear that politician was being soft on immigration or had an agenda on immigration that they didn't. So that's a more deliberate way of using AI to try and distort a narrative.
Well, no further questions, Your Honour.
Do you mind if I just jump in with a question, Santi?
Yeah, of course.
Perfect. This is kind of to the both of you, so feel free to answer. One thing that we've really noted over the course of the Future Proof project is a lot of apathy not just from young voters, but a lot of older ones too. A lot of people saying that they don't really see a point in voting, or all the parties are the same. And a lot of that seems to be attached to a sort of general misunderstanding of the powers and purposes of the Scottish Parliament and why we have Scottish parliamentary elections and why they're important. Given that it's been nearly 30 years since devolution, do either of you think that the civic education in Scotland is in need of a renewal, or that the conversations on social media need to come back to Scotland, especially because social media tends to emphasize more global political issues and especially American political issues, and less so what's actually happening within the country?
So I will defer to Faith on the sort of the more the sort of detailed position on education in schools in Scotland. But what I would say on a more general note is that I think my observation is that the curriculum is so woefully behind the digital skills that kids now need to have in being able to navigate this world, that a lot of what they're being taught of is either very theoretical or is skills based at a level where the technology has moved on, light years. And so, we've just been talking about AI and how things can be AI generated. I talk to my own kids about what they see, and their knowledge of the internet is far surpasses what anything what they're being taught at school in any capacity, in any way whatsoever. And I think that whether it's through citizenship classes or whether it's in computer science or whether it's whether it's in a traditional subject. I mean, what I would like to see is this being more holistically applied right across the curriculum, so that it's not just sort of siloed into a kind of computer studies option, but it's being discussed in terms of language. So for English, in terms of context, around for history, in terms of statistical literacy for mathematics. I mean, I think this applies to pretty much every subject that you're taught at school. But the problem is that the curriculum is very much been organised and created in a very traditional way. And when digital skills like verification, OSINT work is discussed in any capacity in schools, it's almost discussed as a kind of workshop activity, as a sort of an optional extra, rather than properly embedded into future proofing, to use your title, what kids really need for the job force and for the market when they are to leave school. And I just don't think we're really not equipping them for that in any way at the moment. But Faith,
Yeah, and I would, yeah, so just to touch on Mark's point there about, yeah, things, it needs to be across the curriculum. You almost need frameworks or structured dialogues that everybody's using, that young people are getting. And there's work going on, I think, around that in scenes. And I think, yeah, so everybody's saying the same thing within the classroom, and young people are getting the same kind of skills throughout and across the curriculum would be really, and having the time and space to do that as well. We're obviously very exam driven. So, it's time, everything's time pressure. So the curriculum was there was more time to explore things deeply and not just superficially, not just sort of skimming the surface for that. I think with that as well, obviously, it comes from a teacher's perspective. It's about having the professional learning to support all the things that are going on, because you're spending time yourself. Yeah, you should be upskilling to keep up to date with everything that's happening. But just coming back to your question around Scottish Parliament, and I think you mentioned that idea of like civic education, and I think again you said earlier you're preaching to the choir. Yeah, as a modern studies teacher, that was my bread and butter, like having young people really understand the foundations of decision making, power, what democracy is and how it works. And I think again, that's not something that should just lie in the modern studies classroom. It should be across and go younger as well. And a lot of times schools are doing it beautifully, where they're really really supporting that notion of youth voice and young person voice, and how that can really shape the learning environment, and when young people feel that their voices are being heard within their own school and within their own community, and they're linking that to the bigger sort of the bigger pictures that are in place, that can be really powerful, and that builds on that active citizenship that stays with them throughout their life. So yeah, I think there is something to be said for really understanding what the Scottish Parliament does and the impact has on our daily lives, because it has so many devolved powers and that, in all in lots of areas. So yeah, there's probably something in that too.
Just pushing back slightly on an earlier point, which I think Mark raised. Obviously, it's very important to manage the uptake of social media and digital technologies and make sure that the curriculum adapts to the current global situation. Um, at the same time, my mother was a primary school teacher for about 35 years, and she recalls in the sort of last decade of her career a complete plummeting of literacy amongst young children. And that was contemporaneous to the rollout of iPads and Chromebooks in classrooms and the widespread adoption of smartphones throughout wider society. Um, so while it's important to manage that transition, is there any worry that older literacy skills, such as just being able to pick up and concentrate on a book, are being lost? Because part of me worries that attached to this inability to navigate the digital landscape is actually an inability to navigate the analog landscape first. And that many of the digital literacy skills we talk about first emerge when you're able to engage with, say, literature.
Yeah, look, it's a really good point, Robert. And I think you, I don't think any of us would argue that we're arguing for kids not being given that sort of deeper and richer access to literature and reading, and to acknowledge that through language and through that exploration of literature, that they would get the ability to be able to articulate how they feel, what they think about things in a more meaningful way. That is clearly important. But I see the two going hand in hand, that you need to be able to teach those deeper literacy skills, give kids the ability to be able to articulate for themselves in a more meaningful way, but also help them to navigate how that can be applied to a digital environment. So, what worries me is that we all live in filter bubbles of one kind or another, but how much do kids really understand about those bubbles? We all talk about things that are being pushed to us and what we're encountering online without really understanding how algorithms work. And, in a sense, the algorithms of today are a bit like, what television was when it first erupted onto the scene. It's a sort of addictive device to try and encourage, just as when I was growing up, there were sort of TV programs and schedules, and we were all governed, oh God, it's 6 o'clock, we need to be in front of something, or it's 3, that world has passed us by now with streaming. That was the addiction then. And if you go further back, there would have been other addictions involved in, the early printing presses and people sort of queuing outside for first copies of things to emerge off the printing press. The version of that today is the algorithms and the influences that inhabit those spaces that then push content to us in particular ways. And our lack of understanding about what we encounter online. Why am I suddenly seeing something pushed to me as an ad on Google that when I was, looking for something related 3 days ago, and there's no curiosity about that, but yet there is nothing that is convenient about that, in the sense that it's not random. There's nothing random about it. That is all highly calculated and highly processed, and I worry that we're not equipping the kids of the future to fully appreciate that and fully understand the fact that they're just seeing stuff on TikTok today or on Instagram, wherever they happen to be. It's not random what they're seeing. there's no sense of those people, those particular videos, those particular ideas just coming out of thin air to them. It's all being calculated to appear to them because of their previous activity, and we're just not talking about that nearly enough in a school environment, I don't think.
If I could just
Yeah,
sort of add that, if that's okay, yeah, I would agree. And I think it's like about having, it's always teaching that kind of power, like saying to young people, you have the power, you can be in control if you want to be. And I think just going back to your original question about, literacy and things, I think there needs to be space in the curriculum for all of that. And I do think it does go hand in hand. And I think just again, personally in my household, I have a kid and, I just very much try and teach that as much as I can, like good sort of digital hygiene in a sense, like, you're going to be on your tablet, however, can you put that tablet down? And we're not, put it down, put it away, you're done now. Let's go and do something else. And I think rather than just this trying to avoid this constant addiction, which is very, very hard. So I think just having space for all of it in the curriculum is really important.
that's a good point. I think that might be all the time that we've got. Santi, did you have any final questions? Sorry if you don't. Just checking.
No, I think we've covered all the bases.